Um, so I think I'll start by saying where this book came from. And obviously, I'm Paul Nitze's grandson. And in 1999, I was having dinner at his house. He was very old. He was 92 years old, and he'd written an op-ed in the New York Times where he said, we must abandon our nuclear arsenal. He'd come to this conclusion through long thought, but this was obviously not what he had thought through most of his life. He had quite the contrary for his entire life. And so he writes this elegant op-ed in the New York Times. It's sort of the last public statement of his life. And I'm there. We're playing bridge, and a few people are over, and he says he wants to read a letter that he got that day. And it's from George Kennan. And it says in extremely elegant, graceful George Kennan-esque prose, it says, "Dear Paul, I read with great pleasure your op-ed in the New York Times today. Isn't it nice that after 50 years we finally find ourselves in some accord?" And so that planted the seed for this book. And then 5 years later, my grandfather died, and then soon thereafter, George Kennan died, just a few months later. It's a little bit of a Jefferson and Adams connection. And I was at my father's house in Indonesia, and we're talking, reading Kennan's obituary, and he said, "Well, did you know that George Kennan was at your mother's and my wedding?" And I said, and then that suddenly opened, and that suddenly connected something, that these two men who had had extremely parallel lives, but had completely disagreed for the entire time, were actually dear friends. And so that's when I decided, wow, sounds like it could be a pretty interesting book. Let's try to trace the history of America during the Cold War through their rivalry, but also look at their friendship. So that was where the seed for the book was planted, and 4.5 years later, here it is. So I'll tell you a little bit about how the book works, how it flows, what some of the major episodes are, what some of the most fun things are, and then we'll go to questions. The book begins in 1945, where Kennan is serving in the Russian embassy, and he's out in Red Square. The war has just ended. He's giving a speech, and everybody's flocking. They're crowding. The United States and Russia have been allies, and it's a very exciting moment. And Kennan is the highest-ranking American in the embassy, and so he has to go out and say something to the crowd, but he barely can do it. He was George Kennan. He's very shy. He's a deep brooder, and he also thinks this is all sort of superficial. The United States and Russia have been allies, but he doesn't trust the place. He's there during the purges. He understands what's going to happen, and so he's very reluctant. He comes outside and he says, "All honor to the Soviet people," and darts back inside, and then writes a brooding essay about what's to come. Nitze, who's kind of, someone said when I was talking to them yesterday, is the Forrest Gump of the Cold War, is in Germany, and his job is to find and interrogate Nazis, and so he tracks down Albert Speer. And so the book alternates between Kennan's section and Nitze's sections, more or less. And so there's Nitze at the beginning of the war interrogating Albert Speer about the bombing, and he's overwhelmed and he's impressed by Albert Speer's technical detail. And this man who was on the losing side but actually seems incredibly competent, and he's taken in and he's drawn to this knowledge of exactly how German armaments worked. And Speer is giving advice, you should have bombed this, you should have bombed that, and I really didn't want you to knock out the ball bearing factory, so what I did is I put these other factories that I thought you would hit above ground and hit the ball bearing factories so that you would have targets that you would knock out that didn't mean anything to us. And Nitze is overwhelmed and impressed, and this is sort of the beginning of his journey. His next step, he goes to Hiroshima, and he sees what happened with the atomic bomb. He's there a month after it hits, and so this is where he starts to learn about nuclear power and the forces unleashed. So the book begins at the beginning of their careers. This is where the two men start to be important, and it's also the beginning of the Cold War. So that's 1945. I'm going to read you a little bit from 1946. One of my favorite moments in researching this book I was talking to this woman named Martha Mottner, and I've been desperately trying to find someone who served with Kennan in 46. I'm trying to understand what Kennan was like, and Kennan, as most of you probably know, sent something called the Long Telegram, which is the famous 5,000-word document that says, actually, Stalin is not such a good guy, and actually the Russians really aren't our allies. We need to press back against them, and sends this long, sort of belligerent but incredibly elegant memo. And I wanted to find somebody who knew him at the time, and so I go and I talk to this woman, and she says, "Oh, yes, I was there. And do you remember anything about the telegram?" And she says, "Oh, yes, I was there when he sent it." And she told me a good story, which I'll read quickly. And Martha Mottner was working the late shift in the American Embassy Code Room in Moscow on Friday, February 22nd, 1946. It was a bare and austere place filled only with machinery. Polyfilm covered the windows, creating a low-tech defense against Soviet espionage attempts. Mottner was alone in this bleak space as the afternoon turned toward evening. It was George Washington's birthday. No one was around, and her eyes were on the clock. A vivacious 22-year-old graduate of the Fletcher School of Law and Diplomacy, Mottner had joined the Foreign Service out of a determination to go abroad, see the world, and be a diplomat. And the best way for a woman to enter diplomacy in those days was to apply as a clerk. Mottner's academic specialties were political science and history, could barely type. So she found a copy of the typing test paragraph for clerical applicants and went over it about 150 times until she had reached the acceptable speed of 35 words a minute. Diligence paid off. Once hired, she was put on a track that led her to diplomatic postings in Germany and Russia, and then an intelligence analyst slot back in Washington. The clock struck 5, and then 6. Mautner's shift was almost over. She was thinking about her date that evening with the young, handsome Swedish diplomat. The two planned to meet up and then head to a dance party at his embassy. Uncertain he was the right man for her, she knew she could find another if things did not work out. She told me this. She was smart, and working in the diplomatic corps where men vastly outnumbered women, Mautner could basically take her pick. It was nearly 7, and Mautner was ready to bolt when the tall figure of George Kennan appeared at the code room door. A cold, sinus problems, fever, and a toothache had laid him up for the past several days. He'd been last seen upstairs, dictating to his secretary from a couch. But now he was standing before Mautner, holding a thick stack of white papers. He had an important and urgent telegram. It had to go to America, and it had to go now. He handed the stack to Mautner and told her to type it in and send it. She looked with frustration at the first page and its ominous opening sentence. Answer to Departments 284, February 313 involves questions so intricate, so delicate, so strange to our form of thought, and so important to analysis of our international environment that I cannot compress answers into a single brief message without yielding to what I feel would be a dangerous degree of oversimplification. The State Department had asked Kennan to sum up the current situation with Moscow, to analyze Stalin's recent speech at the Bolshoi, and to explain why the Soviets were not going to join the World Bank or the International Monetary Fund. For 3 years, Kennan had sent telegrams warning of Moscow's hostility. He'd been lambasting, haranguing, cajoling, arguing, pontificating, but each quick memo describing Stalin's malfeasance had slipped into the quiet river of unread documents flowing through Washington. Now, Kennan's masters had asked him to let loose, and he had obliged. His work combined the weight and breadth of an essay with the clipped urgency of a telegram, and he wanted it sent. Mautner respected and liked Kennan, but she was also a little bored by him. Besides, she had a date to get to, and sending this document would take hours. She gave it a quick scan, quickly got the gist of it, and handed it back. Does it really have to go out tonight, she asked? You've said all this before. But Kennan insisted. Maybe the message was not new, but this version was important. Most likely no one would read it, and most likely anyone who did would not care. But Kennan had poured it into his anger, his wisdom, and his knowledge of history. He would be damned if this chipper young woman with her Swedish paramour would come between his 5,300 words in Washington. They've asked for it, he said to her, and now they're going to get it. So a lot of my reporting was going and talking to these people who had worked with Kennan and Nitze over the last 65 years, and it was a wonderful experience to learn and to talk to them. And so many people opened up. And one of the great advantages of doing this book as Paul Nitze's grandson is that everybody who worked with Paul Nitze liked Paul Nitze, even if they fought with him, even if they argued. Well, all except one. And maybe you can leave that for the questions. And so a lot of people were willing to talk to me, and I suddenly had the sense of history and the experience of getting to know all these people firsthand. So this is 1946. So Kennan comes back. This message makes him famous. He's appointed to be head of the policy planning staff under George Marshall. So suddenly he's the man who helps design American foreign policy. He's right there. At one point, 3 years before, he had met Paul Nitze on a train. My grandfather's a very social guy. He would go up and talk. If he was here, he'd be around the back sort of talking to everybody. He had seen Kennan sitting in a chair and started chatting with him. So Kennan knew Nitze, and so he asks Dean Acheson, can we bring this guy Nitze aboard? I'd like him as one of my economic deputies. Kennan didn't really know anything about economics. And Acheson says, no, actually, you can't. He's not a big thinker. He's just an operator. So Nitze is denied his first opportunity, but a few years later, Kennan brings Nitze in as his deputy. So the two of them are there at the policy planning staff. They work on the Marshall Plan together. They work on American policy towards Germany. They get along just swimmingly. It's all fine. And then comes August 1949. We know what happens then, which is suddenly happy hour ends. America's had this wonderful monopoly on the atomic bomb, and the Soviets detonate one. So now we've got a problem. We don't have this ultimate power. We don't have a monopoly on it. So we have to decide what we're going to do. And Dean Acheson says, okay, I don't know what we're going to do. Harry Truman says, Dean Acheson, I need you to tell me what to do. Dean Acheson says, okay, Paul Nitze, George Kennan, tell me what to do. So this is September 1949. They have a nice dinner, and as I say in the book, it's the last time in 50 years, 1 month, and 3 days that they actually agree on anything. And from then on, they start to split. And Kennan has been profoundly affected. He believes, nuclear weapons. These aren't just weapons of war. These are weapons that destroy the planet, destroy our connection to our children and to our ancestors. And he gets in this sort of profound funk, and he disappears into his office, and he works on this 79-page paper. And the 79-page paper talks about Shakespeare, quotes St. Paul, and this profound, deep, moving document. And it actually foretells what will happen in the arms race. If we build this, the Soviets will respond, and then we will respond this way, and then our imaginations will be compromised. And Nitze, meanwhile, says, you go write your paper, right? I'm going to do this. I'm going to manipulate this person. I'm going to close off this chain. I'm going to work here. I'm going to move on to this committee. I'm going to squeeze myself in here. He, of course, thinks we should do it. The Soviets, they're going to build a hydrogen bomb. We should build a hydrogen bomb.